of circuit controllers underneath, which
I see.
act as switches.
So it's like a light switch at home, if I can be very simple about it.
Well, that is being very simple, yes. Yes, but it is right, yes.
But it's obviously a lot more complicated.
Instead of bringing a light in, it brings a relay. Operates a relay, or...
I see. So it must actually be
a function.
It must actually be a very complicated system you've got behind all this.
Yes, I would say that's safe to say it is a very complicated system.
What sort of condition was it in before you became part of the museum?
Well, it had been left for 2 years and it was not in a very good condition. We had to renew wiring and relays and reorganise the routes.
Who did all the work?
My colleague, George Williams, and myself.
And are you pleased with the results now?
We're very satisfied with them, yes, we are.
I think
we've achieved quite a lot in the time that was given to us, allowed to us.
Well, I'm sure the visitors are going to get enormous pleasure out of it, and I certainly enjoyed watching it. Thanks very much.
That's very nice, thank you. Thank you.
Now that the old signal box is part of the new Heritage Centre, it has been replaced by a new signalling centre. There are no levers to pull, only buttons to push. That's progress. Now, for railwaymen the world over, crew means not the junction or the station, but the works. The works, as I said, is the reason for the town, but the works is also the reason for local pride, as David Jenkinson will explain.
This may seem a rather strange locomotive to stand representative for all the mighty machines that came out of Crewe Works, but it's got a story to tell. Look at the date on its nameplate. Crewe Works, 1865. And it was built because a year earlier the works had grown so large and had to expand down the Chester line to such an extent that they needed a small miniature railway to operate even within the factory itself. Now, why did it grow so big? The first works was jammed between the Warrington line and the Chester line. Within 5 years they had to fill up the gap between the Warrington line and the Manchester line. A few years later the houses had come so close to the original site that they couldn't expand in that direction. There was no choice within 20 years. Green fields yet again. So down the Chester line they went in 1864. By now they'd decided to make their own steel as well, and they'd set up a Bessemer steel plant. But it still wasn't good enough, because to get down to the Chester line they had to use the main line to Chester, and it was getting so crowded with traffic that they even built a deviation line round the original main line. And all this within the first 20 or 30 years after setting up this tremendous factory. And now I'd like you to meet Francis William Webb, perhaps the most towering genius ever to preside over Crewe Works. He was here from 1871 until 1903, during which time new engines came out of this factory approximately once every 3 or 4 working days. And on one famous occasion in 1878, they did the whole lot in 25.5 hours. So famous was Crewe that in 1913 the Railway magazine claimed it to be the most famous locomotive works in the world. But then things were changing. The First World War came upon us and the railways were amalgamated yet again. And in 1923 the old London and North Western Railway became a part of the even larger London, Midland and Scottish system. The early days of the LMS were chaotic, to put it mildly, and it wasn't helped by the fact that Crewe Works itself was reorganising its method of production. But in 1932, the real successor to Webb came on the scene. His name was William Arthur Stanier, and he came, of all places, from the Great Western Railway. Now, in the popular mind, he was most famous for his blue streamlined locomotives, the Coronation class that ran the new expresses to Scotland. But in fact, he was most important for the complete range of standard locomotives that he built for the LMS Railway. And he couldn't have done it without the manufacturing capability of Crewe Works. And this is Crewe Works in 1935, a year when they built no fewer than 10 Princess-class Pacifics, or 462s, for the Anglo-Scottish services. The boiler and firebox unit, having been put together elsewhere, is brought to the next stage of assembly, the main locomotive frames, onto which it's lowered from huge overhead cranes. The work was very labour-intensive, and the general idea was to move work to the workforce rather than have the workforce moving to the constructional phase. So at each stage of the activity, the whole unit was moved along the belt, as they called it, to the next stage. Now, meantime, the wheels were being finished off by being given their tyres. This was a process of heating the tyre until the wheel could be lowered inside the tyre, and then the tyre was shrunk onto the wheel. When both sides had been done, the whole assembly was then hoisted overhead again to be taken down the belt to the next stage of assembly. This is the driving axle with two huge cranks on it, but there'd be two more without these cranks, very carefully positioned so that the whole boiler, firebox and cab unit could be brought and very, very carefully lowered onto the wheels. You couldn't do it like a motor car by simply taking an odd wheel off by a jack at the side of the machine. You had to do the whole thing in a very careful way. There's a great deal of precision about it too. These were huge, great pieces of metal, but they fitted them with very small tolerances indeed. And the same was true in the forge. This is a white-hot billet of steel about to be made into a connecting rod using a drop forge. And this involved teamwork of a very high order. The men working together as a complete unit, turning and twisting the white-hot metal, and eventually putting it under specially shaped hammers so that the big end of the connecting rod could be reduced to its correct shape, so that at the finishing stage it could be put into the finishing shop and machined so as to be a final and accurate fit on the locomotive. And this fit was again man-handled. And the weight of these components was really quite something. But nevertheless, everything had to fit with a great deal of precision. Stanier was a great workshopsman and insisted on very high quality workmanship. Meantime, elsewhere, the tender had been made in another part of the factory, and the final uniting of locomotive to tender and the steam test could take place before Princess Arthur of Connaught could go and join its colleagues on the main line.
Now that was what they used to build at the Crewe Works, but what do they build now? Well, with me is Norman Hunter of British Rail Engineering Limited, BREL. What are they up to in the works these days?
Doing what we've always done, building locomotives and building them better with more high tech. We're designing locomotives now which use computer-aided design, and we design these at factories. We now can come up with a much more exciting product, both in design and in shape and in operation.
And are they uniquely Crewe locomotives, or can anyone build them now?
Well, we'd like to think they're just Crewe, because we design for our own railway system here, and we're designing for operations around the world. We're hopeful that these vehicles will sell around the world.
And what are your main products then?
Well, the Class 91, which is the Electra program, we're building that with GEC. The Class 87-2 is our own vehicle, and we are the main contractor for that vehicle. It's a mixed passenger locomotive. It can run at high speed for passenger service and for freight.
And will that one go through Crewe?
Yes, indeed, on the main line. It's for all round Britain, in fact. We would think that British Rail would primarily want to use it maybe in the West Coast main line.
There appears to be some confusion in the public mind about British Rail and British Rail Engineering, BREL. Are you still part of British Rail?
We are still a wholly owned subsidiary of British Railways Board, but we run our own operation now. We're at arm's length in relationship with the railways. We run 4 key operational centres in the UK, and Crewe is one of those.
But you don't get all the work for British Rail necessarily.
Indeed not. We have to compete with the private sector for work for British Rail. We're glad to say that over the last 2 years, since they've adopted this policy of competitive tendering, that we've in fact won nearly 60 to 70% of their work.
But that means that you're looking for work from other people too.
Yes, indeed. Overseas markets are growing, and we are certainly looking to increase our share of overseas markets in locomotives, but primarily in passenger coaches. And I think that the majority of what that we now have got to concentrate on for the UK market is high-speed locomotives, as we're doing at Crewe, passenger coaches for UK, and passenger coaches and bogies for overseas.
So you're providers of rolling stock to the world, but is there anything else that you can do in the works if you're short of orders?
Indeed, we've been looking at a policy throughout our works of general engineering. The works have tremendous experience in doing general engineering work, and we can repair engines and gearboxes, we can rewind electric motors. There's a whole new technology moving into the works to maximise the output.
But do you see the works as being central to the future of Crewe as it always was?
Oh, I think so. BREL, I think, in Crewe is one of the most important things for the area. There's a tremendous number of people from our works live in Crewe, and I think it's central, and it's the key, one of the key operations in this area.
So the trick is to produce something that nobody else is producing, that you can sell worldwide.
That's right. Well, we'd like to think the new Class 91 and 87-2 locomotives are just that. We're building these vehicles like we think no one else is building them around the world. Modular, with high tech, with benefits to the customer, and that's really what matters. If we can build vehicles that are of benefit to the customer and don't just look nice, then we'll sell them.
Norman, thank you very much. Well, now they're having an open day at the works this weekend, so they couldn't keep Tony Burton out.
If someone announces it's open day at the local factory, you might expect a few people to turn up. But when it's open day at Crewe Works, they come in their thousands. Enthusiasts all, cameras at the ready. For some, the great attraction is the steam engines, from the Victorian splendours of Cornwall to the giants from the end of the steam age. But a new generation go into ecstasies and sigh nostalgically over the preserved Deltic or the Class 2 diesel. And even the modern engines in for repair draw a crowd. With me is John Evans, the training officer of British Rail Engineering and the man responsible for organising Open Day. John, what do the visitors see when they get here?
They can see the works, that's the workshops themselves, the facilities we have, and the locomotives that are in here for repair. They can also see the new build which we're undertaking at the present time. In addition to that, they can see the visiting locomotives that have come, some steam locomotives and diesels, and a variety of attractions.
I suppose the locomotives have to be the star attractions. How do you choose what you want here?
Well, this year, because we're having the Heritage Festival in conjunction with the town, we have tried to get 100 years or so of locomotives that have been built at Crewe, and we have them from the main eras of the railways.
What does your company get out of opening up like this? I mean, it's a tremendous amount of organisation.
Well, one of the objectives of having an open day is to raise money for charity, and if we can raise a lot of money for charity, then we think we've been successful, and to provide a happy, interesting day for the visitors that come.
The organisation of the event belongs with British Rail Engineering, but most of the preserved engines are here thanks to the dedicated work of enthusiastic owners. Clive Maugenier is secretary of the society that owns Princess Elizabeth.
Well, around 1961, the engine was eventually saved from the scrapyard by Roger Bell. Money was collected to pay BR £2,100 odd, and from then on the society decided that they would like to try and get the locomotive back into working order. Over a long period of years, and it wasn't until 1976 which she reappeared on the main line and was passed for hauling passenger trains. From then on the hard work began. Obviously the engine had to be retubed, but the members in actual fact give their time and money to do this, so that most of their spare time is taken in keeping the locomotive running. For instance, last weekend we had a trip for a charity organisation which was only a short run as far as the engine goes from Shrewsbury to Chester, but that's the sort of thing which the engine does over the period of working life up until we are now past, obviously, until 1993, so that she will be working on revenue earning trips of that kind.
And this is all done by private individuals who've got other jobs as well?
That's right, yes. Everybody has obviously their normal day-to-day jobs, and their spare time is spent maintaining the locomotive and also, of course, the financing of it. This is one of the biggest things because we are not financed by any large company. The members have to fund the engine and run it as well. And that is done mainly by sales events which we travel to all over the country, generating money from those sales events to keep the locomotive running, so that all that money is used just to keep coal in the tender and obviously all the repairs which need to be done.
Well, it's a splendid locomotive. There must be something very special about it to you and to others.
Yeah, there's two things actually. First of all, she was named after our present Queen when she was a young girl. Obviously that is the name Princess Elizabeth, but the second thing is, one of the major items is the fact that she broke the non-stop world record between Euston and Glasgow Euston on 2 successive days in 1936. That was the 16th and 17th of November.
Well, she's a splendid engine. I do hope she keeps steaming for many, many years to come.
Thank you very much, Tony.
With me now is a man who remembers Princess Elizabeth when she was a working girl, Councillor John Bedson, because you're a railway man yourself.
Yes, well, until 5 years ago. I retired 5 years ago, but I worked all my working life was spent on the railway.
And did you come from a railway family?
Yes, my father was a railwayman. He was in crew works. He worked in crew works. My grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather walked from Ruddymowen in North Wales when the Grand Junction Railway opened.
Now, why has it taken so long to have this heritage centre? You should have had it 30 years ago.
Quite true, we should have had it. What you really need, of course, is just the incentive, just the spur to make people do these things. And the 150th anniversary of the town and the Grand Junction Railway was too good an opportunity to let go by.
The Victorians, of course, did it for the 50th, didn't they?
Oh, they had a splendid celebration in 1887, and fortunately they documented everything they did on that day, even to the weather and the menus and the way all the houses in the town were decorated and so on. And in a way that served as a guide and an inspiration to us for what we're doing today. We were determined to do as well as the Victorians.
But this is more than just a party. You intend to keep this thing going.
Oh yes, this is going to be a permanent part of our heritage.
Because I came past about 3 weeks ago and there was nothing here.
No, the whole thing has been done very quickly. We only decided, the council took a decision on December the 19th last year that we would have this celebration. And since then, everything has been, well, everybody has worked so very hard. It was simply a piece of waste ground. It is the site of the original railway works, of course, but it had been disused for years and years. And it was a tremendous task to get it in the state that it is now.
But it's meant to be something more than a museum.
Oh, indeed, yes. It's meant, first of all, to be something that demonstrates that Crewe is a go-ahead sort of place. We're not just wallowing in nostalgia. This is going to spur us, I hope, to go on with the next 150 years. I think that one of the themes, when you read about what they did in 1887, of course, was the optimism that they had there. They were quite determined. They were quite sure that next year the railways would be better than this year and Crewe would be better than this year. Perhaps we're less optimistic nowadays, but nevertheless we feel that we have something to offer in Crewe.
And not just in the railway business.
No, oh no, indeed. We have to recognise now that although Crewe is still a railway town and still a lot to offer to railways, we have to diversify, and this really is what we're trying to do and what we're succeeding in doing.
So should we keep an eye on the business park as the place where Crewe will expand?
The Crewe Business Park is a very important, even more important to the future of Crewe than this exhibition centre. The two things are not unconnected. We feel if we can demonstrate that we can put on something like this in 5 months, then surely we can demonstrate to business people that we can do a similar sort of thing in our business park.
But you expect this to be a going concern?
It will be a going concern, I have no doubt about that. I think that people, not only locally but nationally, are interested in the history of railways, and I think that this is a unique exhibition. We're not really in competition with York Museum and places like that. This is actually a living part of history. We've got around us the historical part of the railways going back for 150 years, and at the same time we've got the very latest in railway technology actually on the site, and trains going by within a few yards of where we've got 150-year-old exhibits. That's something that's quite unique, I think.
But it is not today's trains which have drawn the people on this first weekend at the Crewe Heritage Centre. It is the ancient locomotives, the steam trains. Appropriately, Princess Elizabeth led the way. And to provide a running commentary as seen from the footplate, we invited the chairman of the Owners Society, Ken Andrews, to tell us all.
We're now on the main Chester to Crewe line, and the engine itself is in reverse, and we're just approaching now. We now have a crowd on the bridge, waving. The engine's still in reverse. We're approaching the Heritage Centre. We're now opposite the Heritage Centre. You can see the marquees. The brake is now on, and the driver is now altering the gear from reverse to forward. It's now in forward gear, and the reverser is locked. The brake is off.
Don't move yet, Arch.
And now the driver now is about to move forward.
Pulling us forward now, Arch.
He's now opening the regulator. And closing it again. His hand is steady on the brake. We're now about to enter the Heritage Centre. Crowd lining the fence. The driver's opening the regulator again. We're just coming in past the mound inside the Heritage Centre. You can see people waiting for our arrival. Waving, I hope. Give us a wave. You're on television.
Princess Elizabeth taking her rightful place in the Heritage Centre. Well, now, David Jenkins and I had the best possible view of the cavalcade, so I simply picked his brains. Do you think she's going to get in everybody's way, though, being there?
Well, it's a very tight site, as it were. There are very few sidings, and they're not very long, so there's a great deal of toing and froing got to take place to get everything in the right position.
Because when the Queen comes, they're going to give her a model of Princess Elizabeth, aren't they?
So I believe, yes.
Well, now, once we get her settled and moved, we can start bringing the others in. How many have we got altogether?
I think there are about another 6 or 7 due to come down. The first lot there'll be 4 in the first group, and I think 2 more, plus the ones that are on site already, so there'll be about 8 or 9 there at the end of the day.
Well, now, here they come, led by
number D200. This is a diesel-electric mainline locomotive built in 1959 as part of the new modernisation scheme. British Rail have entered into the spirit of it by painting it in its olden colours, its old colours.
It still belongs to them, doesn't it?
Oh, yes. And here's Duke of Gloucester, a very large express passenger locomotive, then a diesel hydraulic, Western Prince, and finally a Class 24 diesel electric, and all 4 of them built at Crewe at different times in the British Railways period.
And 3 of the 4 now looked after by enthusiasts?
Yes, indeed.
Because are enthusiasts as keen on diesels as they are on the older ones?
Oh, yes, the diesel enthusiasts are every bit as enthusiastic, as it were, as their steam colleagues. There's a certain amount of rivalry between them, though.
But it must be much harder, must it, to find bits for the old ones, the real old steam locomotives, and indeed manuals on how to maintain them than it is of the newer ones.
Well, Duke of Gloucester itself is a remarkable example of that. But the diesels are probably slightly easier to cope with, because, in a sense, that the memory isn't quite so far away. Some of these are still active on the railway, and some only were withdrawn a few years ago.
Why aren't the other 3 under their own steam?
Because there are very strict regulations as to the operation of private locomotives on British Railways. Privately owned diesels are not permitted to run under their own power on the BR lines at all, and steam locomotives have to undergo some very severe examinations.
She's a lovely locomotive, that Duke of Gloucester, isn't she?
Oh, yes.
Wasn't she almost the last one they built here?
The very last express type to be built at Crewe, yes.
I mean, if we hadn't gone diesel, would we still have them?
Well, I don't know whether we'd still have these, but certainly Duke of Gloucester might well have been the prototype, but in fact it was the D200 type that took over only a few years after Duke of Gloucester was made.
And at least Crewe got the job of building it,
Yes.
so they were happy. Here she comes again. All by herself this time.
Yes, and now this is Duke of Gloucester with the going back into its birth. This was an amazing restoration by the people in Loughborough, an entirely privately sponsored affair. It was really nothing much more than a heap of bits and pieces. Half the components had to be fabricated again, and this was a one-off locomotive that might have led the way later.
Who's that?
That's Tony Mosley, who's very much involved with the railway movements on this heritage centre.
Oh, he's the superintendent now, isn't he?
That's
Mr.
right,
Charlton?
yes.
You can't go anywhere without his permission.
No.
Not if you're a locomotive.
He's going to have to undo that a little bit more.
Needs a bigger breakfast.
This is quite a tricky job, actually. Very much part of the older railway methods, the screw coupling.
We used to see that always, didn't we?
Yes,
at the
indeed.
station?
There's still quite a lot of it about, and it can still be quite dangerous if you're not very careful.
There we are. The red dragon goes off.
They're actually being moved around on the
Who's
site.
making all that smoke?
Yeah, there it is. It's called Whiston. It's a little austerity locomotive, again designed by a crewman, a chap called Riddles. And talking of crew, here's perhaps the most famous locomotive on show today, Cornwall.
That's a little one at the front.
Yes, that's the little one at the front. We've lent it to crew from the museum at York, and it's going to stay here all summer.
That's very generous of you. Are you not feared that all your visitors who would have come to York will now come to Crewe instead?
Well, we hope we'll go to both. But Cornwall is what is known as the crew type of locomotive. This particular configuration of the rather distinctive curves at the front and the single driving wheel and the frames holding the motion together. This was very much a product of Crewe in the 1840s and 1850s. Cornwall was built in 1847 and converted to this form about 10 years later.
Where did you find it?
Well, it went on working at Crewe until well into the present century. Used on sort of engineers and special saloons. It didn't do much hard work in the 20th century.
Now, is the big one interesting as well?
Yes, indeed.
They think it is.
Yes, well, this is another Stanier design, and there were more of these built than any other Stanier locomotives, 852 of them altogether, from the 1930s through to the 1940s. Many of them built for service overseas during the war and by the other mainline railway companies as well.
Because you always think of Stanier building only for LMS.
Well, this is an LMS design, but they were built by the other three principal railways during the war because all the railways were effectively in public ownership then, even though they still flew their private colours.
That's a lucky lad on there.
Yes, he's having a great
I never
day.
understand why Stanier didn't put pressure on them to straighten the line up on the west side of the country, and then his trains could have gone even faster.
Well, I don't think the mechanical engineers had as much influence as they'd like over the civil engineers. Perhaps that's what the cause was.
Well, they should have had, because he knew more about railways than they did. Ah, there she is. She is lovely, isn't she, Colin?
Yes, we had it repainted 2 or 3 years ago when it went on special exhibition in Japan, so she's been around quite a bit of this locomotive.
Is she your favourite?
I daren't have favourites, but it's certainly one of the ones that I find a most important exhibit, and very typical of the sort of thing that was happening here in the very early days of this famous works.
She's going to be a great attraction here at Crewe this
Yes,
summer.
it's being placed into a sort of pole position, or the place of honour in the Heritage Centre, where it will stay for visitors to see, safe and undercover.
A final word. Is the new Heritage Centre at Crewe going to be a success? Tony?
I think so. I've been walking around this morning, and what struck me is the local people are enjoying it so much. They're saying, oh yes, I recognise that, and Dad told me about that, and I remember Grandad telling me about that one. So for them it's a great success, and that's a success for Crewe, I think.
David?
Well, echoing what Tony said, and it's also a great success for the people who put it together in something under 6 months. I think that's amazing. And the nice thing about it is that it's not just about engines and machines, it's about the people of this town. And railways were about people, no more than here. I don't see it can miss.
And lots of people will come, you know. They reckon there are 6 million railway enthusiasts in Britain, 60 million in Europe, 600 million in the world. So Crewe is not going to be short of visitors. And when they do come to Crewe this time, they'll know what to do.
On the 4th day of July I recollect well what bustle there was in the morning, I'll tell, with the lads and young lassies so buxom and gay, delighted and talking about the railway. Travel by steam, so the folks say, all the world over upon the railway. So now, me good fellows, let us be all free, again fill the glass and now merry we be. Success to all trade in the reign of our Queen, and the boiling hot water that travels by steam. Travel by steam, so the folks say, all the world over upon the railway.
Miles Kington continues his Steam Days series by going west on Sunday at 5:55 on BBC1, visiting Temple Mead Station in Bristol and meeting the Iron Duke, the first engine to haul the crack passenger expresses of early Victorian times.
Tomorrow on BBC2, a new comedy series, City Lights, featuring the exploits of Willie Melvin, a young man with lots of ambition but little talent.
Oh, so you're up at last. Do you know I've been calling you for half an hour? Your breakfast will be cold. Now, you'd better buck up your ideas, young man, or you'll be getting the sack.
No, I'm not. I've already quit.
Yeah, what?
Calm down. I haven't actually already quit. But I've already thought about it, and I'm going to do it.
You know, your poor father fought in the war to get you that job.
Should you not have fought a wee bit harder and got me a better one?
What's to become of you if you leave the bank?
I've told you before loads of times I want to be a writer.
But that's hardly a real job now, is it?
Harold Robbins thinks it is. Graham Greene thinks it is.
Well, stop hanging around with him.
A new comedy for Friday evening, City Lights, begins tomorrow at 9 o'clock on BBC2.
Over on BBC1 now, the 9 o'clock news with Julia Somerville and Philip Hayton. Here on 2, we join Paul Heine and company live in Manchester, blowing away the cobwebs with news of various holiday jaunts in The Travel Show.